In the last lecture, we analyzed the Prabhuji explanation about the verse Om Purnamada Purnamidam, which is the invocation of the Ishavasya Upanishad. And we analyzed it in the view of meditation, how it relates to meditation. We learned that idam and adha means this and that, and those two words actually describe a separation between two directions, the directions of objects and the direction of the subject. So we have everything that you experience, the objects of the world, and we have the subject, which is the experiencer. And we saw that in meditation, many times the common way to explain meditation is to slowly go and observe the objects, everything, starting from more gross objects like body, breathing, things that are more tangible, more easy to observe, and going slowly into objects which are more subtle, like thoughts, feelings, and so on, like mental objects. And then we remained with the question that when Prabhuji explains that the verse is saying Purnam, which is the wholeness, the fullness, is both this and both that, both the objects and both the subjects. So, in other words, what the verse is trying to say is that, in essence, and this is what Prabhuji is saying, in essence, both these things are the same. And we had them repeating this text from Prabhuji's explanation, which talks about this. Existence seems to offer two situations, the subjective and the objective. Besides subject and object, there is no third possibility in life. Consequently, by affirming that Adaha and Idam are Purnam, the Upanishad is flatly stating that only Purnam really is. The Upanishad could have simplified its statement by just stating that the totality includes everything. There was no apparent need to divide reality into that and this. However, the sage preferred not to omit or ignore our dual and relative differential experience. Our ordinary experience is characterized by the difference between the observer or subject and the observed or object. In such dual experience, we do not perceive ourselves as part of the observed or idam. However, according to the message of the Upanishad, the essence of both the observer and the observed are one and the same, Purnam or limitless totality. Now, as I said in the last lecture, Prabhuji actually brought a few verses to illustrate the whole point of this explanation, and last time we just skipped those. And here we want to actually look at those verses and see what they have, what they say. And the first verse is from the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 13. It's the second verse. And it's saying, Idam shariram kaunteya, kshetram iti abhidyayate, etad yoveti tam paho, kshetrajna iti tad vidha. And what this means is, Idam shariram. So we have the same word, idam and shariram. Shariram means body. So idam means this, from the same verse as the Ishavasya. So what this means is, this body, Kaunteya is son of Kunti, it's a way to call Arjuna. So he's saying, this body is kshetram iti abhidyayate, is called the kshetram. Kshetram is field. Like Kurukshetra is the field of Kuru. Shariram, this body, is called the field. Okay? And why is it called the field? Because it's where everything in your life happens. That's one of the explanations. So everything in your life is like a field. So what we have here basically is the same differentiation we had before with object and subject, just in other words. Here it's called the field and the knower of the field. And now, the field is not, when we talk about body, we don't mean, in this context, just the body. We mean everything that is an experience. So basically, like we said before, everything that's an object. So the field is not only the body, is including the mind, is including the senses, because everything is in the body. So our brain, our senses, the mind, the feelings, all of that is part of the field. And all of that is something that is observed. And the subject, that is the knower of the field. So what this means is we can take the way Prabhuji explains the verse Om Purnamada Purnamidam, and we can ask, okay, so what is actually talking about in light of this verse? And what he is talking about is the process, or the, let's say, the phenomena of knowing. As the verse says, knower of the field and the field and the knower of the field. We're talking about knowing. Now, we're not talking about epistemology. We're not talking about what is knowledge right now. We will come to it, but we're not talking about what is knowledge and how to know if what I know is true or not. That is not the subject here. Even when we're talking about the field and the knower of the field, no one is saying that what you see or what you know is true or not. That is not the point. The point is just the fact of knowing, the very basic phenomena of observing something, of knowing something, of being conscious of something, of perceiving something. The ability to perceive anything. And that is really the point. So we can rephrase the verse, this is Purnam, that is Purnam, to say the knower is Purnam and the known is Purnam. It's the same thing, it's just different words. And then also we don't talk about knowledge, if the knowledge is correct or not. And we get to the term of Purnam, because this just illustrates the same idea of Idam and Adaha, just with different words, the object and the subject. But when we want to know what is Purnam. And Purnam, Prabhuji explains, in the Ishavasya Upanishad, is what other Upanishads called Brahman. Brahman is a term in Vedanta which is very, very significant. We mentioned it in previous lecture, but we never got to talk about it in depth. And Prabhuji writes, with the term Purnam, the Ishavasya Upanishad refers to what other Upanishads call Brahman, as stated by the Taittiriya Upanishad. According to the testimony of those who have accessed this reality, it is the unique essence that lies behind all things and all beings. These sages have realized the absolute reality as their own authentic nature. So here we have this verse from the Taittiriya Upanishad, and the verse is actually longer than what is mentioned in the book. In the book is only the part that defines, brings like the explanation of what Brahman is, but the verse is a little bigger, and I want to share with you the full thing, because it has a few interesting things. The verse first line is Brahmavid apnoti param. And Brahmavid means the knower of Brahman. Apnoti means attains, and param is the highest. So it literally means the knower of Brahman attains the highest thing. And just a side note here, when we say attain, don't think about it as something that we achieve, something that we purchase, like I attained a degree in astrophysics, something like that. No, but it is a way of the Upanishads to say this is the point of everything we talk about. This is when, the realization, you got to the biggest maximum realization a person can have in his human life to realize Brahman. It's just the Upanishadic way of saying that. But don't understand from that Brahman is something to be achieved or enlightenment is something to be achieved as like you achieve anything else. That's what I wanted to emphasize. And so now we got to the words that Prabhuji put in the verse, and that is Satyam Jnanam Anantam Brahma, which means Brahman is absolute reality, knowledge, and infinity. Now, so if we read the whole thing, is Om, the knower of Brahman attains the supreme. Here is the verse uttering to that fact. Brahman is the absolute reality, knowledge and infinity. And in continuation, he who knows that Brahman is existing in the cave of the heart, in the supreme space, in identification with the omniscient Brahman, enjoys all desirable things simultaneously. The Taittiriya Upanishad. Until now, we spoke about the subject of the differentiation between subject and object, between knower and known, but we haven't touched knowledge itself. And here is something very, very significant and we can discover something very interesting in the commentaries of Shankaracharya to this verse, because we didn't talk about knowledge. And it seems that here we are getting into knowledge. Now, again, we're not going into the whole topic of Vedic epistemology, which is very big, but just to give one note. In Vedanta and in yoga and in all these darshanas, there are what's called pramanas, which are the sources of correct knowledge. One of them is called Shruti, which is basically scriptures. Not any scriptures, but obviously scriptures that come from enlightened beings, from rishis, from people who actually saw the truth, had access to the truth. And Prabhuji mentions this in the commentary a bit after. So when we have this kind of verse that explains what Brahman is, it's accepted as a source of truth, meaning we take this verse as true. However, it's not as simple, because there's a way of what we'll see here is there's much more depth into just taking this as is in face value. And for that, we need to get into the subject of what is actually to know something. Because we talked about object and subjects. We talked about the knower and the knower of the field. But how that translates into knowledge, how that interaction between the subject and the object, what is the process that converts this to actually knowledge, the knowledge that we have, because we have knowledge. Not talking about if it's true or not, but we have knowledge. It might be wrong, it might be right. That's not the point here. But how does it become knowledge that we can talk about? Because We have books of many subjects filled with our knowledge. We have certain knowledge. We learn things all the time. What is the process that from observation you pass into knowledge? And Prabhuji here writes something that doesn't seem to be exactly talking about that point, but it actually is. And listen carefully. It is impossible to limit wholeness within a form. Any outline, whether physical, material, astral, ghostly, or spiritual, implies a boundary or a limit. A silhouette that does not demarcate an inside and an outside is meaningless as a form. From our relative and partial perspective, we perceive ourselves as bounded within a limited world that is different from us. We perceive the limitation of an objective world distinct from the perceiver. The experience of a difference between subject and object conflicts with the assertion in the Upanishads that the essence of both the observer and the observed is Purnam. Diversity necessarily implies limitation. Prabhuji here repeats the question about how can the subject and object have the same essence? But he's also saying something more, something significant about knowledge. And if you read carefully this text, you'll see that he's talking about a form. To have a form, any form. If you want to have a form, you need an outside and inside, a silhouette, the border of that form. You have to use the border to separate that form from everything else, right? And let's take the most simple form, a binary image, or something like a font of an alphabet. Let's say we had to create a font for the ABC, for the alphabet. We can do any design we want. We can do it as elaborate as we want. But the whole point of a font is to be able to identify the letters. And let's say in our font, the letters look exactly the same. Meaning, let's say the I is a line, and the L is also a line, and it looks exactly the same. How can you differentiate? Or maybe we'd make the D and the O and the 0 exactly the same, or extremely similar. That will not be a good font, because the person reading will not be able to know if it's a 0, if it's an O, if it's a D or this. And if you notice, that's the whole art of fonts, is to, even if they are very stylized and designed, they still have to maintain the clear difference between one letter and another, otherwise the whole thing is meaningless. So, why I brought the example of a font? Because imagine if the whole universe was just white paper, and all the forms that existed were just characters. The only way to differentiate between the characters will be a difference in the form. If the form is the same, it's the same character. Now, let's take that analogy and not think about forms, of graphical forms, but about knowledge. We know things, and everything we know is because we can differentiate that thing from other things. So, obviously, very simple things like physical objects, like chairs, tables, bottles. Like, imagine a baby comes into the world and he starts learning things. Like, he learns that this is called a table, this is called a chair, this is called a car, this is called a house. And he learns because a table and a chair is different. A car and a tree are different. Now, those are very simple things, but the same exact thing is true for everything that we know. Even the most complex, abstract mental things are still things that in order to know, we need to be able to differentiate them from other things. So think about words, because eventually all our knowledge translates to words, because in words we understand and we communicate our knowledge. So think about words and think about synonymous words. To really know the meaning of words, that you can really use the words, you need to know the difference between the words, even if they are very, very similar. For example, if you take the word significant, real, important, and substantial, all these words are very similar in their meaning, but there are differences. They're not exactly the same. And those differences are what allows us to know what each word means. Because if they meant exactly the same, then there would be no difference. It would be just the same idea with different names. But because there are subtle differences, it's not really one idea. It's a few ideas. Okay, so where does this get us? How is this related to the discussion about Purnam? Now, Prabhuji said that in the Upanishads, what the Upanishad is calling Purnam is Brahman. And we have this verse from the Taittiriya Upanishad that seems to give a definition of Brahman. It's saying Brahman is Satyam Jnanam Anantam. It's truth or absolute reality, knowledge, and infinite. So, but as I said, going deep into the commentary of Shankaracharya, into this verse, we will find something interesting. And Shankara actually writes a very lengthy explanation of this verse. A very complicated commentary to this verse. I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's a few pages, but we're going to go through his argument, because he develops a very interesting argument that allows us to understand what really it means to define Brahman. And he writes, the sentence Satyam Jnanam Anantam Brahma, Brahman is truth, knowledge, infinite, is meant as a definition of Brahman. For these three words are meant to distinguish Brahman, which is this substantive, or the noun, in other words. A thing becomes known when it's differentiated from others. This is what Shankara is speaking. And this is exactly what we said before, about in the example about the forms and the silhouettes and all that. A thing can be known when it's differentiated from other things. So, it seems very simple, like we said. We can know things because we differentiate it from other things. And now we have this definition of Brahman, which comes from the scriptures. And the verse said, the knower of Brahman attains the supreme. Seems very simple. But here is when Shankara starts breaking this down. And the way he does it is putting an objection to his own idea, and then answering it, and then putting another objection and answering it, and another objection and answering it. And this way he goes and develops something. And this is what Shankara writes as an objection to himself. An adjective is meaningful when there are many nouns belonging to the same class, like a blue lotus. But it has no meaning with regard to a single noun. There is a single Brahman. There do not exist other Brahmans from which it can be distinguished. So Shankara is basically saying, no, that can't be true, because an adjective is used, that word is used because you want to differentiate things of the same class. Let's say you have a flower, he gives an example of a lotus flower, so you can say, okay, this is a blue lotus flower, this is a yellow lotus flower. You differentiate between the lotus flowers. But Brahman is only single, one. There's not many Brahmans, so you can differentiate between them. And Shankara replies to himself by saying, yes, but an adjective can also be used in another way. An adjective can not used not only to differentiate between things in the same class, like when we talked about the lotus flowers, but in the sense of giving attributes to those things. So the words Satyam, Jnanam, Anantam are attributes of Brahman. It's like saying Brahman is Satyam, meaning Brahman is truth, Brahman is absolute reality, or saying Brahman is Jnanam, knowledge or consciousness, or saying Brahman is Anantam, infinite. Okay? And then he goes and now he actually goes into every one of these things and starts to explain them more in depth. A thing is said to be satya, truth, when it does not change the nature that is ascertained to be its own. And a thing is said to be unreal when it changes the nature that is ascertained to be its own. Hence, a mutable thing is unreal. So the phrase Satyam Brahma, Brahman is truth, distinguishes Brahman from mutable things. So now he's saying that these things are attributes of Brahman. They give a definition of Brahman. For example, Satyam, that the word means truth, but also comes from the verse of reality, of something that exists. So it also means absolute reality because, as he said, in this context, Satyam is something that never changes. So whatever never changes, that is real, that is truth, that is absolute reality. And Jnana means knowledge itself, not an agent of knowledge, not someone that knows. And Ananta means infinite, and he gives a very beautiful, very poetic way of describing infinite. What is infinite? When there's nothing else to know. When there's impossible to know anything else. Okay, so we seem to have a definition, like with certain attributes, and we say, okay, this Brahman is this and that, is absolute truth, is knowledge, is consciousness, is infinite. But this still doesn't work. Shankara comes back with objections and more objections, and it doesn't work because even if you start thinking, okay, you say that Brahman is something, a certain thing, and then you start thinking, well, is it really? For example, talking about knowledge. And knowledge, but knowledge implies change because if you know, then you know new things. And if you just said that Satya is something that never changes, how can it be? And how can it be infinite if there's something to know? Because you said infinite is where there's nothing else to know. So, and then there is the biggest problem that Shankara, in the objections he presents, and he goes back to the beginning of the verse that we said, the knower of Brahman attains the supreme. And Shankara said that this little verse is the most important thing in the whole chapter, because this is the point of everything, to know the self. And he say, if Brahman is the self, it becomes an agent of cognition, since the self is a knower. So Brahman, being the cognizer, is you cannot. It's improper to hold that Brahman is consciousness. Meaning, if you said that the self, knower of the self, then there's an agent, someone who knows. So the thing becomes complicated, and the thing becomes like more and more complex. And these like, how can you get out of this? And so Shankara continues to bring more explanation. Knowledge, which is the true nature of the self, is inseparable from the self. and so it's everlasting. Still, the intellect becomes transformed into the shape of objects when cognizing things. The consciousness of Brahman is inherent in Brahman, just as the light of the sun is from the sun. Brahman is not the agent of cognition. It cannot be denoted by the word jnana. Brahman is indicated but not defined. Okay, so now he's saying, you know what? These words are not definitions. They just indicate Brahman. They just kind of point to it and give some kind of idea, but it's not a definition. And so, wait, what is this whole thing? Like, you started saying it's a definition, then you said those things are not adjectives that differentiate it from other things, but just say its qualities. Then you said it's a definitions, and then you say that it's not a definitions because there are contradictions in these things. So what in the end? And then he says something very interesting. It is proved that Brahman is indescribable. And unlike the expression a blue lotus, Brahman is not to be construed as the import of any sentence. Meaning, actually Brahman is, you cannot describe it. You cannot talk about it as you talk about anything, an object, like a lotus flower. A lotus flower, yes, you can define, you can describe, you can say it's like this and like that. Brahman you cannot describe. So even those words are just, and he actually says it's a way of courtesy, it's a way of saying something about it, giving some idea, but not defining. So in all this like convoluted and long discussion, Shankara begins with what seems to be the literal understanding of the verse, because the verse is saying Brahman is this and this and this, is truth, is knowledge, is infinite. But when he actually goes into and breaks and starts to poke holes into what does actually mean to be that it's truth, it's knowledge, the thing breaks apart. It doesn't. You cannot logically understand it like that. And then it finally says, listen, actually Brahman is not something that you can describe. You can say things about it, indicate it in some way. Shankara is saying you can say things about Brahman, but like Prabhuji is saying, a lot of times that scriptures should be read as poetry, not as literally. And this is the whole discussion of Shankara, is showing you that if you take it literally, it breaks apart because it doesn't make sense. There's logical contradictions. So you can't take it literally. And you cannot describe Brahman. And there's no way that from reading a text, you can have an understanding of what Brahman is. Brahman is saying, is never the result of a sentence, of reading something and understanding the words. And coming back to Prabhuji, now if we read the same text, we'll understand what he's talking about. It is impossible to limit wholeness within a form. Any outline, doesn't matter if it's physical, material, or even if it's spiritual, implies a boundary or a limit. Anything has any kind of limit that we put. We cannot put it. And a definition is a limit. A definition is to put limits around something, and now I know that. This is knowledge. Putting a limit around things, and now that is the process that converts the observation into knowledge. We observe something, we observe reality, but then we start putting limits on things. and then it becomes knowledge. And what he's saying is impossible to put a limit on wholeness, on the fullness, on Purnam. What Prabhuji is saying here is that everything we know inside this experience of subject and object. We know it by drawing these outlines around objects. Even they are mental, even they are very abstract, there's still a limit. We need to be able to differentiate it from everything else in order that will be knowledge of it. But Purnam, Brahman, wholeness, is impossible to put a limit around it. The attempt to put a limit, even a mental limit, to give it a definition is doomed to fail from the beginning. And this is this big discussion of Shankara is what is showing in his commentary. However, and what Prabhuji is emphasizing it, is why this text is different, for example, from the text of the Taittiriya Upanishad, or other places where Brahman is defined or talked about, is because in that explanation of Brahman, which Shankara is proving that is not a definition, but still we have no reference to the subject-object experience, the dualistic experience. This is the dualistic experience of subject and object. And Prabhuji is saying, here is something unique, because here, this, in the Ishavasya Upanishad, they're saying something very, very specific. How you cannot define Brahman, but we don't ignore the reality of subject and object, the reality of the dual world, in which there is definitions and knowledge. But what we have to discover is that the subject and object, the essence, is the same, is Purnam. What we didn't yet answer that question. How exactly is that happen? How is that possible? But we do know one thing, that it cannot be a mental knowledge definition as everything else. We cannot get to there by putting some kind of limit of defining a state of Purnam as different from other things. We will continue to explore this in our next lecture. Jai Prabhuji.